if a coach doesn't try to understand and using empathy to understand individuals, then they don't know what their potential is and what sort of areas that they really excel in. And when they're picking a team, there's obviously certain tasks within any team, any sport that need people selecting to do that specific task. And there are different situations and contexts, and there are high pressure matches, there are away games, home games. All these things make a difference to who you select if you know the individual. It gives the coach more empathic accuracy if they've bothered to understand who is best for each situation and each position and each context. So that's going to improve performance as well.
Welcome to Season 15 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Sear, who is a chartered psychologist who holds a master's degree in human resource management and industrial relations, as well as young and post-Jungian studies. His PhD thesis is entitled Understanding Empathic Leadership in Elite Sport, and Peter went on to publish this book, Empathic Leadership, Lessons from Elite Sport, which draws on his findings and working with leaders of teams in a variety of sports from around the world. Peter lives with Jennifer and their two teenage daughters in the beautiful South Downs area of West Sussex in the UK. And in his spare time, he still plays football, aka soccer. He cycles, he writes, and paints. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. You make me sound like a really interesting person. Thank you.
And you are, because we're going to include, for people who want to go even further into your book, a link where you are talking for 10 minutes about the book and what motivated you to write it. I have so much to ask you. I think that this is going to be an important conversation for coaches. And I also think it's an important conversation for parents who have kids that are athletes, whether it's in amateur sport or whether or not they're sort of climbing rank and entering elite, because I think there's a lot to be culled from some of what you've learned from these elite athletes. So I know that you believe that over the last 2 decades, there's been a shift away from sort of like an autocratic, top-down, assertive type coach to something that is more of an empathic coaching of nature. So could you describe to me, let's visualize together 20 years ago, a quintessential coaching dialogue between a coach and an athlete that is not empathic. What does that sound like?
Yeah, so I think there was probably a lot more shouting involved. There was a one-size-fits-all approach. So the coach would do things his way, and it was his way or the highway. It was if you didn't fit into his culture or his way of thinking and didn't obey what he said, then you weren't going to play. That's the general way that it's been described to me by athletes of that era, and that I experienced myself as well in sort of amateur sport. It just seemed to be that you could see it on in the media as well. That's the way that coaches treated their athletes. There are always exceptions, of course. There are always people of all eras that have been a bit more empathic. But in general, coaching now is a lot more empathic than it was a couple of decades ago.
So now, if it's more of an empathic way of coaching, does that mean that, I'm often asked the question that empathy gets in the way of performance. So, like performance-oriented organizations, if all of a sudden their leaders are more empathic and, develop a more empathic leadership style, that all of a sudden performance is going to diminish. Can you contradict that?
Yeah, I think it's the opposite. It's, for a start, when you have that sort of leader that we described a couple of decades ago, a lot of talent in sport was being lost, because if an athlete came to a club as a teenager or something and didn't feel understood, and didn't fit into that way of being told what to do and being the same as everyone else in the squad, then they'd often just drift away from the sport, or the coach wouldn't select them because they'd think that they weren't fitting into the way that they wanted it done. So that's one way in which performance is affected, in that talent's lost. Another way in which it's affected is that if a coach doesn't try to understand and using empathy to understand individuals, then they don't know what their potential is and what sort of areas that they really excel in. And when they're picking a team, there's obviously certain tasks within any team, any sport that need people selecting to do that specific task. And there are different situations and contexts, and there are high pressure matches, there are away games, home games. All these things make a difference to who you select if you know the individual. It gives the coach more empathic accuracy if they've bothered to understand who is best for each situation and each position and each context. So that's going to improve performance as well.
As I was coming into the conversation with you, I was reminded of a book that I read while I was writing my book. So it took me about 12 years to get my book done. And it's not because I couldn't actually sit down and, I had the capacity to type words. I think, anybody who, has written a PhD thesis knows how to write something. There's something psychological about putting a piece of work out to the world for other people to digest. And the book that I read that helped me a lot was Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art, which had been recommended by a friend of mine. And that book essentially is making the claim that anybody who's putting something out into the world, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're an artist, I imagine also if you're an athlete, he didn't speak specifically about sports, but anybody who's doing something that is not strictly performance, but is a contribution where other people can publicly consume it or enjoy it or take it in, there's a huge psychological element to it. So Pressfield says that you either are an amateur at your craft or you're a pro. And turning pro is where you have the capacity to slay resistance. And he calls resistance everything under the sun that gets in the way of you actually delivering this thing, he calls it a muse, this thing that's coming through you. So I'm imagining, you're a psychologist, you have athletes that are actually skilled technically, and, they practice on the field, they do their scrimmage or their shots or whatever, they run their things with their teammates. But so much of what's happening on the field or on the ice or in the pool is in their heads. So can you unpack a little bit of that as a psychologist?
Yeah, very much so. You're right. I speak to a lot of different therapists in sports organisations like physios, fitness guys, things like, and they all tell me that they often say to psychologists like me, you're the one that holds the key. Really, it's 90% psychology. We know that now, and that's really powerful. When I hear that, I think all the knowledge they've got, and that's what they say. So, yeah, I mean, if you, as an athlete, going back to the leadership relationship, if you feel like you fit in somewhere, that's huge. And if you feel you're valued and that you matter, there's a lot of research on mattering, the sort of that you feel you matter to a coach, then that's massive as well. And then if you know that the coach recognizes your strengths and knows what you can do and sees potential in you, then that's perceived empathy. That's really powerful. And that increases commitment from the athlete, and it gives them confidence to go out and be creative and do their job well.
So is what you're talking about primarily suited towards team sport, or can it also be applied for, the kind of sport where you're track and field, for example, you're not, playmates?
Yeah. My research was on team sports. So I researched head coaches of 10 different team sports. But I think it applies to any sort of athlete-coach relationship or any leader sort of relationship with anybody. I've spoken to lots of different people from different industries. I mean, I was speaking to a guy who's head of HR in a big shoe company, for example, yesterday. And he said that he's found the ideas from the book really helpful with young recruits, etc. So it's about the ideas and the philosophy about how you treat human beings to get the best out of them. And I think if we go back like thousands of years to how human beings were in tribes and everything, the leadership that we're most used to in life, for like 95% of our existence, was that leader who knew everybody inside out in the group and knew the strengths of each individual, so that they could appropriate tasks accurately to who was best suited to them. And so we're back to that, rather than where we came off track, perhaps, with sort of farming and industrial leadership, where the leader of or someone who was in charge of a factory just needed somebody to do their specific job on a production line, and their psychology to do that job probably didn't matter as much, or how they felt about their leader probably didn't matter quite as much. It certainly wasn't something that they explored. It was a tell leadership culture, and I think that was us going off track, and we're back now to understanding that we need to be more human if we're going to get the best out of human beings.
So belonging, the sense of belonging is so important to us as human beings. And there's research that shows that the reason why young people gravitate towards gangs, for example, which is not necessarily you live your best life in a gang, but they're attracted to it because they're very good at creating a sense of belonging. So what are the strategies to create a sense of belonging on a team that could be useful for elite coaches who are listening or watching, or even sort of your peewee club?
Yeah, I think that's right. When we look at sport, all the people that are going to be the next sports stars, if you like, the people that come in through are sort of in their teenage years as well, when that sense of belonging is the strongest it is. And you see teenagers will gravitate to different cultures, like just to feel that they're within a group. And so it's at an age where that's more important than anything else. But to do that, the coach has to make sure that the athlete is seen for who they are, so that the athlete feels they're recognised, they're seen, and they're known. They're really known for who they are. And so they need to gather information about that athlete. It's no good seeing them as just a shirt number, which is probably the way coaches saw athletes in general 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's got to be looking at it's person-centered. You know, that's the big sort of word in this. Is it's a person-centered style of leadership. Carl Rogers came up with that idea of person-centered for the therapy room, and it's been researched in work as worker-centered and in sport as coach-centered. And empathic leadership certainly encompasses that.
So do you believe that the coaches who practice empathic coaching and empathic leadership benefit themselves personally?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I tried to consider the negatives to empathic leadership when I was researching it, and to try and ask the coaches about if there were any negative, sides to it. And one of the ones that worried me most was that being empathic to all these people that they have to have relationships now with head coaches, because it's not just athletes, it's the team of specialists that they have around them now, which has grown. Squad sizes have grown. They're having relationships with media people above them and below them in the club, or other staff. So the head coach has to maintain a lot of relationships. You know, it's multifaceted. So I worried that would be a drain on the head coach, and that it would end in burnout, if you like. So I asked head coaches about this. None of them agreed with that. They all said that the experience of empathizing with athletes had more positive experiences to share in the negative, because their aim was to develop people, develop athletes. So they were watching people go on to improve, have success, not only in their sporting life, but also in their personal life, and sometimes just their personal life. I had head coaches who said that they were so pleased with the effect that they'd had on an athlete off the field, you know, developing them as a person, and how they'd gone on to have a career in something completely different to sport. So the shared empathy, or the sharing of worlds that the head coach moves into with an empathic style, they said was more positive than negative. So it didn't have a burnout effect in their eyes.
I love that. So there's this feedback loop that is positive. So it's not a drain
Yeah, I mean, there are always going to be negative events. I mean, that's part of the empathic leadership's role as well, to help people with their personal lives. If they're going through a divorce or something like that, then the coach is there for them. And if an athlete sees that the coach is caring about them in that situation and listening to them, or if they see them doing the same for one of their peers, that again is really powerful, and it makes the athlete think, oh, he was all right with that guy when he was going through that. So I know I can go to him, and I can trust him. And if the head coach has got their own experiences to share, that increases the trust as well.
Makes me think of this television show that I've watched. I'm sure you know. It's this American guy that comes over and becomes the coach of a football team in the UK. What is it called?
Ted Lasso.
Ted Lasso. Are you a fan?
Yeah. I wrote a article for Psychology Today about him, actually, because he is the epitome of the empathic coach, and he often quotes people, other coaches from other sports like basketball and that. There's a lot of their quotes in there, and it's a symbol of how leadership has changed, that show, because it does encompass all the sort of modern ways of leading. And I think sport is a fantastic arena to for other industries to learn from, because it's such a transparent industry. All the things that you see on a show like that. But anybody who supports a local sports team, the media are constantly scrutinising it. The fans scrutinise it. All the people in the background, all the managing directors, CEOs, the owners. It's all very transparent, and the performance of the sports team is obviously once or twice a week. And so that's a really powerful thing as well, that they're being judged that often, and it's a really high pressure environment because of that. So if empathic leadership is doing well in that environment, and we see that the leaders who are winning trophies are considered empathic leaders, then it should work well in every industry involving people.
And as I'm listening to you talk, I'm reminded of this Maya Angelou quote that I really love. That it goes something, if I get it right, people will forget what you say, people will forget what you do, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
Yeah.
And I usually think about that quote in relation to teaching, right? The positive impact that teachers can have in a classroom. And I think it's totally applicable to the coach model that you ascribe to. Could we get the lay of the land in terms of these 10 different sports and across different parts of the planet? I would love to get a sense of the breadth of your research, and also maybe a couple of anecdotes that you have, because it's a very accessible book. You've got a lot of quotes from coaches in the book that you might want to share because you think they're great.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I wanted to write the book so it was accessible to coaches and leaders from any industry, really, because I'm quite aware, having read lots of academic books myself, that they're not the most enjoyable books to read, and the style that they've written in is not a style that I enjoy writing in anyway. So, but I thought if I could incorporate the quotes from coaches as well, then I'm even closer to the language of coaches. So it should read really well for them. It was interesting to look at different cultures and how they see empathy. One coach I had who's coached in UK and Scandinavia handball also coached in China. And it seemed the further east you go in Eastern Europe and in Asia, there was kind of less of an appreciation for an empathic leadership style in sport. He gave me a great example of, he was trying to get the athletes to sort of loosen up and enjoy themselves and try to understand how he could make training more fun for them. And the people above him were really critical of him because they saw the athletes smiling in training, and they really didn't like that. So that's one example of how he thought he was doing a really good job understanding the athlete and getting them to enjoy life and come out of themselves and perform better because of it. But in that culture, there's still a belief that it's hard work that gets you anywhere, and you should be doing what the coach says and not, your feelings shouldn't be considered so much, So that was a good example. There are loads of examples in the book, as you said, but there's a great example of a ice hockey coach who I mentioned before about the importance. He said that his personality, he doesn't think would have suited being a head coach 20 years ago because of the differences we've talked about, and that he really cares about other human beings and people are important to him, and his job wasn't more important than the relationships he has. And one athlete he said didn't work hard enough in training, and him and the other coaches talked about it, and they talked to him and they tried to understand why, and they eventually got him working really hard And that spilled over into the rest of his life. And he worked really hard in his schooling and college and university, and ended up becoming a medical doctor. And the head coach said to me, he wasn't a great ice hockey player, but he's now a fantastic doctor with a family, and he feels, slightly responsible for having that impact on his life. And he said that's worth more than any trophy to me. So that's the kind of people that we're talking about. And you listen to some of the most successful coaches who are considered empathic today, and they talk similarly about relationships. I don't know if you heard of Jurgen Klopp, who's just left Liverpool Football Club. He always talked about, it doesn't matter how people feel about me when I join a club, it's how they feel when I leave, which relates a bit to the Maya Angelou quote that you said.
Love that. Love that. So one of the things that I think you believe is important for coaching is to not only get to know the athletes, but get to know the stories of the athletes. And the reason why I want to unpack this is some of what you're describing reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend who works with horses. So she's an equine coach. She brings in groups of leaders who want to develop their leadership skills, and horses are very attuned. Anyways, I experienced an amazing session with her, so I speak highly of the work, which surprised me because I'd never heard of this before. And she also taught me that horses work in herds, and there's always an alpha male, and the alpha male's role is to bring out the best in the herd. Like that is the job, mic drop. And so I think that's what an athlete, an elite coach would do too, is to bring out the best of each member of the team. Now, if we go back to the psychology of each athlete, some athletes come from traumatic circumstances or disenfranchised or marginalized circumstances. So part of the psychology is not just about the how to show up with a winning mindset or a growth mindset. Some of it is just, maybe imposter syndrome or a feeling of insecurity or inadequacy because they've been raised in a home where there wasn't a lot of love or tenderness shown. So I'm just wondering how elite coaches can why it's important to take the extra time to understand the context of an athlete as part of their coaching.
Yeah, I think that's really relevant in team sport as well, not just with the coach, but with the other players or the other athletes. So that's where it differs to individual sport. So a lot of the coaches I spoke to work with the athletes so that they understand each other and there's empathy within the team. And one of the things they do is share biographical stories, because in a sport like soccer, football, for example, in Europe, teams are made up often of, there might be 10 different nationalities in a squad, and they've all got these fantastic stories about where they came from. And some of them are the poorest areas in the world. There's a lot of Africans playing and people from really poverty-stricken lifestyles in South America and things like that. And so they've all got their individual stories. And I've heard athletes say that they thought they had it tough until they heard so-and-so speak about his life. And that brings people together. If you have an understanding of what someone else has gone through to get into the team with you, where you are in that moment, then you're more likely to sort of pull for them as well. And it brings that joint commitment together and team cohesion.
Now, what happens with jealousies? I guess social media and popularity of different athletes as they ascend to their stardom. How do you play that out?
Yeah, there's two things I thought of when you said that. One is, with this new empathic style of leadership, you get coaches having closer relationships with athletes. But sometimes what can happen is that other athletes will see that the relationship with specific athletes might be getting a lot closer than it is to anybody else. And that can produce problems. So if I suppose the ideal empathic leader will be aware of that and not make sure that it's a balanced sort of thing that they're portraying. I think the problem with jealousy is facilitated even more by the social media situation. I had one coach tell me that sometimes he'll have a player who's played quite well themselves, maybe scored a few goals, but the team's lost. And then that player goes home and shouts about it on social media, how good I was today, I scored all these goals. And the rest of the team are thinking, yeah, but we lost, And so that splits him from the rest of the pack, if you like. So that's a problem that has to be managed. And social media is a really growing problem as well, because a lot of athletes have the dilemma of where their real commitment lies these days, whether it's to the club that they're playing for, to the manager, which is more likely to be committed to an empathic coach, but also to their brand and the other work they do outside sport, which might be bringing them in as much money as the actual wages they get from the club or organisation. So keeping up their brand and reputation might be something that they do at expense of their relationship with the team or the coach. And then, as you say, if someone's doing very well with their brand, the other players are going to see them as apart from them, and it weakens that cohesion.
Right. So again, coaches have the dual job of being experts at the sport, but then also psychologists of the team.
Yeah, they have to be people. Yeah, we in soccer and football, we often used to talk about good man managers. Like some coaches were sort of split into two groups: the sort of dictatorial coach or the man manager. And I think the empathic leader is obviously more like the style of the man manager, someone who understands people. You know, and I think you can really. It doesn't take long to tell the difference in what kind of coach you are. You know, you've only got to talk to the players about their coach, and you can see the way they look on their face straight away, whether they feel a good connection with them or not.
So what would be good advice to a coach, not so much to create the sense of belonging, to get to know their team at the individual level, to manage the dynamics, but to get out onto the pitch or the field or the ice and win the game? So what is some empathic coaching strategies to actually bring home the trophy?
Yeah, well, there's lots. I mean, there's a book full of them there. But if you're talking about in the competition scenario, so while the actual game's going on, that's an important situation to be considered, because as a head coach, even though the players are engulfed in their thoughts of what's going on the pitch or ice rink or whatever, they will be glancing over to the coach every now and again. And so the body language, any words that they hear from the coach are really important. And it's also important to the people around the coach. There'll be other squad members maybe sitting behind the coach. And it's important for the coach to remember that they're listening as well. And if they see the coach, for example, talking to their assistant about being in a really critical way about how people are performing, then that squad player is going to feel more pressure going onto the ice themselves. So all the time, the coach is being watched. So that's something to really, really consider, is that the way they behave, not just how they coach in training or the team they pick, but their behaviour is always being analysed. And I think that's when it comes down to the kind of person you are, because you can learn to be more empathic, certainly. I'm not saying you can't, but I think in many people, this is a more innate way of being, that you understand how your actions and behaviours affect other people and the way they feel.
So, okay, practically speaking, you're a coach, you're watching your team. Let's make this about football,
Okay.
like European football, soccer.
Yeah.
Okay. And you've got a great athlete who makes a mistake. You know, it happens. As a coach, you could be super like, disappointed, frustrated, irritated. So what's the body language meant to show in that moment?
Well, I've seen a lot of these coaches that I'm talking about, when they see a situation like that, where there's a period of play that leads to an opportunity to shoot for goal, for example, and the shot misses. But I see the coach now, where they didn't in the past, applauding that, because it was about the play to get to that situation, and that's the most important thing. And a lot of these coaches talk about the level of performance being more important than results, because the results will look after themselves if they keep up this level of performance. And that seems to be more the aim of coaches today than it used to be.
Got it. Sort of the Aristotelian excellence is not an act, but a habit, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about self-empathy for coaches when they screw up and they make human errors and they've got people booing them or making bad calls?
Yeah. It kind of, I think to fans, you can see how tough it is, but our empathy for them may be limited because they, even if when they lose their jobs, they often get paid their contracts off and get millions of pounds from it anyway. But it's a very important aspect of empathic leadership, self-empathy. It's where I start the book. Understanding your own emotions and how you react to certain situations is vital. If you're going to choose how to display your behaviour to the team in training and on the sideline, then you've got to really understand what triggers you and how you react to certain situations. I had one coach explain to me that before a really big match, he and the coaches were talking about the players doing their warm-up and saying they look nervous. Like, why are they so nervous? How can we relax them? And after a conversation with each other, they realised that it was them that was nervous and not perhaps the athletes. Mm-hmm. And that led to the head coach giving a completely different team talk before the game. So understanding yourself is really a priority, yeah.
So do you have any excellent advice about, what did you call it? Because, you know, it's the famous, in the movies, wherever there's a movie, Hollywood movie about teams, there's always that conversation. What did you call it?
What was that? The pre-match talk.
The pre-match talk, right? Yeah. So any special strategies or best practices about how to galvanize your team?
Well, I heard a really good example in the Champions League final about a week or two ago. Carlo Ancelotti, the Italian head coach of Real Madrid, who won, at half-time, apparently, after Real Madrid hadn't played that well. So the coach usually gives a talk at half-time. And this is a fantastic example of empathic leadership. He's got a squad of players at Real Madrid who are probably the best squad of players in world football and some of the most experienced, talented and knowledgeable players in the world. And so his first thing he says in the changing room at half-time is to ask the players what they think is going wrong. And gathering information from the people who are on the pitch and know what's going on. It reminds me of there's a book by David Marquet, Turning the Ship Around. He was a submarine commander, and that's an excellent book that sort of overlaps with empathic leadership, I suppose, about going to the people who know their job for information. So Ancelotti knows he's not out on the pitch. He's got 11 experts to draw knowledge from. So he draws knowledge for them, and then he says, right, this is what we're going to do. And they go out in the second half and they win the game.
Amazing story. And it also, I think, speaks to the something that happens collectively in the air that we can't put our finger on, whether it's momentum or something in the air that people have intuition around, that it's not just about the technical, run up this at this angle and kick it at this speed. It's something about this cohesive energy, right, that we all feel and see.
Yeah, that's massive in football, in particular in Europe. The atmosphere the crowd creates, for example, that's huge. Like Liverpool Football Club is really famous for their home atmosphere at Anfield. They often teams, other experienced coaches have said that's why they've been so successful in European football, because of their atmosphere there. And that leads me to think of how important it is when a coach takes a job that they understand the fans as well. So you need empathy for the fans. In any other business, it's empathy for the customer. But you need to really understand the sort of people that are coming to watch your football every week. Certain club fans will expect a certain style of play. They won't accept a more direct, unattractive style of football. Even if they win, they won't like it. And a coach will understand what gets the atmosphere of the fans going as well. What sort of things to say before the game, maybe to the press.
And that makes me think about Nelson Mandela using rugby to unite South Africans in post-apartheid.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's another great example of empathic leader. I actually mentioned him in the book because he knew that when he was in prison, that his best route of success was to understand the guards that guarded him. He didn't fight them. He talked to them, got to know them, understood how they felt about the world. And that's how he learned about how to be a leader when he came out.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, I have two more questions. You've touched on it a few times, but now I'm going to make it more explicit. In
Go on.
doing this research about elite coaches and how to become empathic leaders in those roles, how much of that is translatable to the corporate sector, to the private sector, to the nonprofit sector, to the public sector,
Yeah.
workers in suits carrying briefcases with laptops?
Yeah, well, there is research that's been done. So before I did this research, I'd seen research on insurance companies and things like this that proved that empathic leadership sales, the empathic leadership worked. It brought results. But since I've written the book, I've had messages from anybody where teams are involved, really. So in hospitality, like hotel chains, I've had people that I've been speaking to about doing some work for as well for them. Like I said, a shoe company last week. Lots of different industries, and as I said before, the beauty of sport is that it's such a transparent industry, and it kind of acts like an advert for empathic leadership because everyone sees that these coaches are not behaving like they used to. They see them hugging athletes, which is indicative of that close relationship they have with them. They hear the way athletes talk about them, and they're sort of intertwined in their personal lives as well as their professional lives. The head coach will get to know the families of the athletes and understand their whole wider world. So look at the person holistically.
Love that. So it definitely translates. So I'm going to hold up this book again for any leader.
Yeah, anybody in any industry can buy that and succeed. Yes.
Beautiful. Okay, I also want to talk about coaching children and any nuggets, any advice, any strategies, because I think there's at least on this side of the pond, a growing tendency to move away from the empathic leadership because they want their kids to win at all costs.
Yeah.
And there's sort of bullying going on among parents even attending the game. So what advice have you got there?
Yeah, I think that happens everywhere, but I have heard that about American soccer in particular in recent years, that there's so much pressure on the kids and that winning mentality set. And I've seen coaches in this country start to engage with games when they play other clubs with their academy games of different scenarios so that the athletes have different challenges that are perhaps not validated by the score. So they'll have different shaped and size pitches. They'll have different numbers of players on each team just to give them different challenges so that it gives the opportunity for the parents to see what they're doing to develop rather than thinking, right, if we win this match this week, we'll be above that team in the league and takes that out of the equation. I think that's really important because if the emphasis is on results, coaches of kids teams will often play the strongest, the biggest, the fastest players who tend to sort of recede in their ability as they get older, as other kids catch up with them physically. And then the other kids who are catching up with them haven't had that experience. So if you're going to do what's best for the A team, if you like, the first team, then you've got to nurture everybody because you don't know the ones that are going to be the best of the bunch at the end. So that's really important, yeah.
Beautiful. A couple more questions bubbling up, if you'll indulge.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I came across, when you do these self-assessments, and you learn about your top 10 qualities or your weakest points, that there's some research showing that instead of trying to improve where you have shadow weaknesses, you actually should identify your strengths and work on those because over time that will take you further. Sort of not to ignore the weaknesses, maybe you're self-aware, but not to fix them, to actually spend time working on them. Have you come across anything like that in elite sport?
Yeah, I think that's a sort of, personal philosophy thing, but I think that's where it's key for the leader to understand what the strengths are of each individual. And if they're choosing somebody because of those strengths and playing them in a position or a situation where those strengths are needed, then that's enough, isn't it? The weaknesses might not be relevant in that situation, but there's not a decision to be made unless the coach really understands the potential and strengths of each individual athlete.
And what goes in, I'm just curious, this is not so much about empathic leadership, but what goes into the decisions? Because I'm curious, since you're such an expert on this, making the call, let's say, you're doing penalty kicks and you're choosing your 5 players. What's the psychology of making those choices?
Yeah, that's a prime example of this. So if you're a head coach choosing who's going to take those first 5 penalty kicks for your team, what do you consider? Do you consider first of all, you want as much information as you can about each individual athlete, right? So then some of that information will be who is technically the best, who scores the most in training. But then you also have to factor in is that this isn't training. There's 100,000 fans screaming. You might be taking the penalties at the away end where all the other fans are swearing or pulling faces or doing everything they can to put you off. Or you might be taking penalties at your home end where your own fans bring their own kind of pressure or support. And so if you know the individual, you'll understand how they react to those 2 situations, how they react to the high pressure situation of taking a penalty anyway. And then you have to factor into their technical ability as well, and then make a decision based on all that. But you're making an informed decision based on all those variables, not just who the best guy in training is.
Love it. So based on your research, I mentioned at the top end, you have 2 young daughters. How has it changed you as a partner, as a father, as a citizen in the world to know what you know about empathic leadership?
I think the biggest thing I learned about empathy when I was studying all this, and it seems obvious maybe now, but I think a lot of people still make the same mistake, is that when you're trying to be empathic with somebody, you don't put yourselves in their shoe. So I'm not imagining what I'd do in my daughter's situation. I've got to become my daughter to really understand how she feels about that situation. So that's a huge thing in your thinking, isn't it? That extra step of becoming the other. And coaches have talked to me about that as well. So often you get people who become head coaches in sport are the ones that have been seen as the real fighters on the pitch with the real passion, But then they expect their athletes to be of the same mold. And they have to learn to understand that not everybody is built like that. And people bring their strengths to the game in different ways. So I think that in personal and professional life, that's a really important thing to do, is to really consider how the other person feels in that situation, not how you would feel in that situation.
I love that, because so many athletes, like elite athletes, become coaches, right? Yeah. And
some of the best athletes often don't make the best coaches, and some of the worst athletes can make the best coaches.
Yeah, I can understand that. And so now imagining you trying to step into the shoes of your daughters. You're a male, so now you got to be a teenage girl and imagine the world.
So they play netball, which is a sort of Commonwealth sport that I've never played. So I don't understand exactly. I don't even understand all the rules of that. So when I'm thinking about them playing that, I'm looking at it as a footballer all the time, how you pass and stuff there. And then they both dance. They've done ballet and stuff like that. My sister did ballet, and I've grown up in a bit of a ballet world, but I'm still a real, novice. So it's very difficult for me to understand their situation when they go into a competition doing that or a performance. But you just have to use whatever knowledge you can gather in order to understand what they're going through. But I think it is a reminder to do that, studying all this. It does keep empathy at the top of your mind.
Especially as a practice, right? Empathy as a practice.
Yeah, and I also read a lot as well. I've always, since I've been an adult anyway, I've been a lover of classic fiction, and I'm quite interested the way fiction can be used to develop empathy, because the more you read, the more you're putting yourself in different people's situations all the time, and the difference between really good quality like classic fiction, which doesn't do too much work for you, so you're left to do it yourself, whereas sort of more trashy fiction explains everything too much, Yeah. And then it doesn't. I don't think it helps you develop empathy so much.
Oh my God, you're making me think of my English classes in high school around the metaphor.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, last question, and it's been such a pleasure, Peter. This has been so delightful. I knew it would be a great conversation, and it has been. My final question to all the guests on the podcast is about your life, and if you can think of a time when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
Yeah, there's one thing I remember. I was 10 years old at my primary school, my junior school, and I was made captain of the football team. And the sports teacher at the time, I don't know whether he's still around, Mr. Knightsbridge. If you ever hear this, Mr. Knightsbridge, hello. He made me captain of the team, and I remember we had training before the first match, a couple of days before the match, and he called me over during training, and I thought, what does he want? But I still remember this, several decades ago. So it was obviously a powerful thing that happened. He started asking me for my advice about picking the team. And so to a 10-year-old boy, for an adult to say to you, what do you think about playing him there, and that all of a sudden I mattered. So he showed me some of the things that we talked about. He showed me that I mattered, that I've been recognised, that I'm being listened to, which is an important part of empathic leadership, and that my opinion is valued. So I think that's a fantastic example that I was given back then, and may even be part of why I went on to study this, because I know what that did about the way it made me feel at that age, that it made me feel like I was somebody all of a sudden.
Oh, I love that story. Let's keep that in mind in terms of how we can walk around, for those who have been watching or listening, look for ways today or tomorrow for how you can make others around you feel like they matter. What a great gift. I love that story. As a PS, there's a Netflix film that I watched with my husband and daughter recently. I can't remember the name, but I'll find it and include it in the show notes. Maybe you've seen it. It's about the homeless games. So there's...
Oh, yeah, I haven't watched it yet. I've heard about it, yeah.
Okay, you haven't watched it yet. Okay, so anyways, one day if you do, let me know.
I will, yeah.
I thought it was absolutely fabulous. For those in North America, you'll know the game show The Price is Right. So I'm a sentimental person that when somebody wins the car, like I'm crying anyways. And I kind of knew going into this film that I would be touched sentimentally, but it's just such a great film. And I think sports, the highest aspiration of sports, like the Olympics is coming up in a matter of a few weeks in Paris, in France. It is to bring us together, right?
Yeah, we've got the Euros starting today, the European Football Championship. So Scotland playing Germany tonight, the first game. So it's a really exciting summer, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, Peter, for your time. We'll see you next.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So now the invitation is to subscribe to the channel and consider picking up a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.